They told me my wedding speech was too long and cut me off after 30 seconds. What they didn't know was that I owned the building where they planned to live their perfect married life. Sometimes the people who silence you forget that your voice carries more weight than they realize. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emily Roberts, and I was 72 years old when I learned that love doesn't always speak the same language as respect. It was a crisp October morning in Burlington, Vermont, when the wedding invitation arrived in my mailbox, nestled between a utility bill and a grocery store circular. The envelope was thick, expensive, the kind of stationery that whispers wealth before you even break the seal. I had been living in the same Victorian house on Maple Street for 47 years, the one my late husband Theodore and I had bought when our son Marcus was just learning to walk. The wraparound porch still creaked in the same spots. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon from decades of holiday baking, and the second-floor window still offered the perfect view of the maple tree that had grown from a sapling into a towering giant alongside our family. Theodore had been gone for 8 years now, and the house felt both too big and exactly right for a woman who had spent her retirement years collecting memories instead of clutter. I filled my days with watercolor painting, tending to my prize-winning rose garden, and managing the small portfolio of rental properties that Theodore and I had accumulated over the years. Our little nest egg, he used to call it, though it had grown into something more substantial than either of us had ever imagined. The invitation was addressed to Mrs. Emily Roberts in elegant calligraphy, and when I opened it, I found myself staring at a photograph I didn't recognize. Marcus, my son, stood arm in arm with a woman I had met exactly 3 times. Her name was Vanessa Crawford, and she had the kind of polished beauty that looked expensive even in casual clothes. She worked in marketing for a tech company in Boston, drove a white BMW, and had opinions about everything from wine pairings to interior design that she shared with the confidence of someone who had never been told she was wrong. I studied the invitation carefully, noting the formal language, the venue, the Shelburne Farms estate, certainly not inexpensive, and the RSVP instructions that directed me to a wedding website rather than a simple phone call. Everything about it felt distant, impersonal, like I was being invited to witness someone else's life rather than celebrate my own son's happiness. Marcus and I had always had a complicated relationship, though I suppose most mothers would say the same about their adult children. After Theodore's death, our conversations had become more frequent, but somehow less intimate. He would call every Sunday evening, ask about my health, update me on his work as a financial advisor, and we would dance around the larger questions that neither of us seemed brave enough to ask. He lived 3 hours away in Boston, close enough to visit but far enough to maintain the careful distance that had grown between us over the years. When he had first told me about Vanessa, it was during one of those Sunday calls, mentioned almost casually between updates about his golf game and a work promotion. She was great, he said, really successful, really driven. The way he described her made her sound more like a business partner than a romantic interest, but I had learned not to question his choices too closely. I had made that mistake before, during his first engagement years earlier, and the resulting argument had created a silence between us that lasted nearly 2 years. I met Vanessa for the first time at Marcus's birthday dinner last spring. She arrived precisely on time, carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than I typically spent on groceries in a week, and complimenting my home with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had been coached on what to notice. She admired my garden, asked thoughtful questions about the house's history, and managed to make conversation that felt both engaging and somehow hollow, like beautiful wrapping paper around an empty box. During dinner, she dominated the conversation with stories about her work, her travels, her 5-year plan, that included everything from career advancement to the exact neighborhood where she and Marcus would eventually buy their forever home. She spoke about the future with the kind of certainty that made me feel like I was listening to a business presentation rather than getting to know my potential daughter-in-law. Marcus watched her with obvious admiration, nodding along to plans that seemed to have been made without much input from him. The second time I met her was at Marcus's apartment for Easter dinner. She had taken over the cooking, dismissing my offer to bring my traditional honey-glazed ham with a bright smile and an explanation that she was trying to introduce Marcus to more sophisticated flavors. The meal was undeniably delicious. Some kind of herb-crusted lamb with roasted vegetables I couldn't identify, but it felt like eating in a restaurant rather than sharing a family meal. She photographed every course before we ate, adjusting the lighting and angles with the focus of a professional, explaining that she was documenting special moments for her social media followers. The third meeting had been just 6 weeks ago, when they had driven up from Boston to deliver the wedding news in person. They sat on my living room sofa, Vanessa's engagement ring catching the afternoon light streaming through the lace curtains, and announced their plans with the kind of choreographed enthusiasm that suggested they had rehearsed the moment. Marcus seemed happy, genuinely so, but there was something in his expression that reminded me of the way he used to look when he was trying to convince me he had finished his homework when I knew he hadn't. Vanessa had a binder with her, an actual 3-ring binder with color-coded tabs, filled with wedding plans that had apparently been in motion for months. She showed me venue photos, catering menus, and a timeline that accounted for every minute of their wedding day. When I asked about my role in the ceremony, she had smiled that practice smile and assured me that they wanted to keep things simple and intimate, which seemed to translate to limited and controlled. Now, holding their invitation in my hands, I realized that I knew almost nothing about the woman my son was marrying beyond her impressive resume and her ability to plan elaborate events. I didn't know what made her laugh, what she was afraid of, or how she treated people when she thought no one was watching. I didn't know if she understood that Marcus still called me when he had nightmares, even though he was 35 years old, or that he cried during every movie with a sad ending, or that he had spent 2 years after his father's death sleeping in my guest room because he couldn't bear to be alone with his grief. What I did know was that she had strong opinions about everything, including how other people should behave at her wedding. She had already sent a detailed email to all the family members about the dress code, the timeline, and the flow of the reception. She had hired a wedding coordinator whose job seemed to be ensuring that nothing unexpected or unscripted would interfere with her vision of the perfect day. I sat at my kitchen table, still holding the invitation, and tried to imagine myself at this wedding. I pictured the elegant venue, the carefully curated guest list, the photographer who would direct us into perfectly composed family portraits. I imagined sitting quietly at whatever table I had been assigned, smiling politely at strangers, and watching my son marry a woman who had already begun reshaping his life in ways I wasn't sure he fully understood. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Marcus, calling to make sure I had received the invitation and to ask if I had any questions about the arrangements. His voice carried that particular tone he used when he was trying to manage a situation, the same voice he had used as a teenager when he was hoping to avoid a difficult conversation. "The venue looks beautiful," I told him, because it was true, and because I wanted to start with something positive. "Vanessa found it," he said, and I could hear the pride in his voice. "She's been planning this for months. She has everything organized down to the minute." I wanted to ask him if that was what he wanted, a marriage organized down to the minute. But instead, I asked about the weather forecast and whether they needed help with any last-minute preparations. He assured me that everything was under control, that Vanessa had thought of everything, and that all I needed to do was show up and enjoy myself. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen and tried to remember the last time I had felt truly included in my son's life, rather than simply informed about it. I thought about Theodore, about how he would have handled this situation, about the conversations we might have had about wedding plans and family dynamics, and the delicate balance between supporting our son's choices and protecting our own hearts. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I pulled out the photo albums from the top shelf of my bedroom closet and spread them across my dining room table. I looked through pictures of Marcus as a baby, as a toddler taking his first steps in our backyard, as a little boy learning to ride his bicycle on this very street. I found photos of family vacations, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduations. A lifetime of moments when we had been a team, when his happiness and mine had been intertwined in ways that felt natural and unbreakable. Looking at those pictures, I realized that somewhere along the way, I had become a spectator in my son's life rather than a participant. I had been so careful not to overstep, so determined not to be the kind of mother-in-law who caused problems, that I had stepped back too far, made myself too small, allowed my voice to become too quiet. As I closed the last album and returned them to their shelf, I made a decision. I would go to this wedding, and I would find a way to be more than just a polite presence in a dress that matched the color scheme. I would find a way to remind my son, and perhaps his new wife, that some relationships have roots that run deeper than wedding planners and color-coordinated ceremonies can account for. I just didn't know yet that my opportunity would come in a way I never could have imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The weeks leading up to Marcus and Vanessa's wedding passed in a blur of preparations that somehow managed to exclude me entirely. While I had expected to be involved in some capacity, perhaps helping with flowers or offering advice about catering, it became clear that Vanessa's vision of wedding planning didn't include input from anyone outside her carefully selected circle of vendors and coordinators. I received exactly 3 phone calls during those weeks. The first was from Marcus, asking if I needed directions to the venue, as if I hadn't been driving around Vermont for 7 decades. The second was from Vanessa herself, calling to inform me that the photographer would be taking family photos before the ceremony and that I should arrive 30 minutes early wearing something in dusty rose or sage green to complement their color palette. The third call came 2 days before the wedding from someone named Brittany, who identified herself as the wedding coordinator and wanted to confirm my meal preferences from a list of options I hadn't known I was supposed to choose from. Each conversation left me feeling more like a guest being managed than a mother being included. I found myself wondering what Theodore would have thought about all this formality, this distance wrapped in politeness. He had always believed that the best celebrations happened when people felt free to be themselves, when laughter came naturally, and speeches were heartfelt rather than rehearsed. The night before the wedding, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, trying on the dusty rose dress I had purchased specifically for the occasion. It was lovely, I supposed, though it felt more like a costume than something I would choose to wear. The woman looking back at me seemed smaller somehow, more carefully contained than the Emily Roberts who had raised a son through scraped knees and broken hearts, who had built a marriage that lasted 39 years, who had turned a modest inheritance into a thriving collection of rental properties that now provided security for several families in Burlington. I had been managing rental properties for more than 20 years, ever since Theodore suggested we invest his retirement bonus in real estate rather than the stock market. What had started as a duplex on Cherry Street had grown into 8 properties scattered throughout Burlington and the surrounding areas. Nothing fancy, mostly small apartments and starter homes that appealed to young professionals and graduate students, but well-maintained and fairly priced. I took pride in being a landlord who actually cared about her tenants, who responded quickly to maintenance requests and remembered birthdays and graduations. It wasn't the kind of work that impressed people at dinner parties. When strangers asked what I did, and I explained that I managed rental properties, their eyes often glazed over, as if I had just described the most boring job imaginable. But I loved the work. The problem-solving, the relationships with tenants who became like extended family, the satisfaction of creating homes where people could build their lives. One of my properties was a charming 2-bedroom apartment on Pine Street, just 6 blocks from the University of Vermont campus. It had hardwood floors, exposed brick walls, and a kitchen that overlooked a small garden where I had planted herbs and flowers for the tenants to enjoy. The apartment had been vacant for 2 months, and I had been taking my time finding the right renters, people who would appreciate the character of the place and take care of it like it was their own. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had called with an unusual request. He and Vanessa were looking for a place to live after their honeymoon. They wanted to stay in Vermont for a year while Vanessa established a remote work arrangement with her Boston company, and they were hoping to find something charming and authentic that would give them a taste of small-town life before they settled permanently in Boston. "I know it's a lot to ask, Mom," Marcus had said, "but Vanessa fell in love with Burlington when we drove through last month. She thinks it would be romantic to start our marriage somewhere with character, you know? And I thought maybe, if you knew of anything available." Of course, I had immediately thought of the Pine Street apartment. It was exactly what they were describing: charming, authentic, walking distance to restaurants and shops, with enough space for a couple starting their life together. I could picture them there. Vanessa setting up her home office in the sunny 2nd bedroom, Marcus grilling on the small back patio, both of them discovering the farmers market and the hiking trails, and all the small pleasures that made Vermont special. I had offered to show them the apartment the next time they visited, but Vanessa had insisted on seeing photos first. I spent an entire afternoon taking pictures from every angle, highlighting the original crown molding and the renovated bathroom and the way the afternoon light streamed through the living room windows. I even included shots of the garden and the neighborhood, wanting them to see not just the apartment, but the community they would be joining. Vanessa's response had been enthusiastic. She loved the exposed brick, the hardwood floors, the quote, authentic Vermont charm. She had already started planning how she would decorate the space, what kind of furniture would work best, which corner would be perfect for her yoga practice. Marcus seemed equally excited, though I suspected his enthusiasm was more about pleasing Vanessa than about the apartment itself. We had agreed on a lease that would begin the week after their honeymoon. The rent was fair, perhaps even generous, considering the location and amenities, and I had waived the usual security deposit since Marcus was family. I had spent the past 2 weeks making small improvements to ensure everything was perfect for their arrival. Fresh paint in the bedroom, new fixtures in the bathroom, a thorough cleaning that left every surface gleaming. Standing in my bedroom the night before the wedding, I felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about the months ahead. Having Marcus and Vanessa so close would mean more opportunities to build a relationship with my new daughter-in-law, more chances to be involved in their daily lives, rather than hearing about their milestones through occasional phone calls. I imagined Sunday dinners at my house, spontaneous visits when they needed advice or just wanted company, the gradual development of the kind of comfortable intimacy that I had missed since Marcus moved away. I had even prepared a small welcome gift for their first day in the apartment. A basket filled with locally made maple syrup, fresh bread from the bakery downtown, coffee from the roastery on Main Street, and a bottle of wine from a vineyard just outside the city. I wanted them to feel welcomed not just to the apartment, but to the community, to understand that Vermont wasn't just a scenic backdrop for their Instagram photos, but a place where neighbors looked out for each other, and relationships grew slowly but deeply. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant October light that made the maple trees look like they were on fire. I took extra care getting ready, styling my silver hair in a way that felt elegant but not overdone, applying makeup that enhanced rather than masked, choosing jewelry that complemented rather than competed with the dusty rose dress. I arrived at Shelburne Farms exactly 30 minutes early, as instructed, and immediately felt like I had stepped into a magazine spread. The venue was breathtaking. Rolling hills dotted with sheep, the lake sparkling in the distance. The historic buildings perfectly maintained and decorated with tasteful arrangements of white flowers and greenery. Everything was flawless, from the string quartet tuning their instruments on the terrace to the servers setting up the cocktail station with military precision. Brittany, the wedding coordinator, appeared at my elbow almost immediately, checking my name off a list and directing me toward the family photo area with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing large events. She wore a headset and carried a tablet, and everything about her suggested that this wedding would proceed exactly according to schedule, with no room for spontaneity or surprises. The family photos were a careful choreography of poses and groupings, each combination planned in advance and executed with professional efficiency. I stood where I was positioned, smiled when directed, and tried not to notice how many of the photos seemed designed to minimize my presence rather than include it meaningfully. When the photographer asked for immediate family only, I wasn't sure whether that included me or not, and the moment of hesitation was awkward enough that Vanessa stepped in to clarify that yes, of course, Marcus's mother should be in the immediate family photos. But even as I stood beside my son, his arm around my shoulders, and both of us smiling for the camera, I felt like I was playing a role rather than simply being myself. The photographer directed us to look natural, which somehow made everything feel more artificial, and I found myself wondering when family photos had become such elaborate productions rather than simple captures of genuine moments. After the photos, I was escorted to the cocktail area where other guests were beginning to gather. I recognized a few faces. Marcus's college roommate, some cousins I hadn't seen in years, a few family friends, but most of the crowd consisted of Vanessa's people. They were uniformly well-dressed and articulate, the kind of people who discussed wine varietals, and weekend trips to the Cape with casual sophistication. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and tried to insert myself into conversations that seemed to flow around me without quite including me. It was during the cocktail hour that I first learned about the speeches. I was talking with Marcus's Aunt Helen, Theodore's sister, when she mentioned how excited she was to hear what I would say during the reception. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Your speech," Helen clarified. "As the mother of the groom, I'm sure you have wonderful stories about Marcus growing up." I felt a flutter of surprise mixed with anticipation. No one had mentioned speeches to me, but of course there would be speeches. At every wedding I had attended, the parents spoke, sharing memories, offering blessings, welcoming new family members. I had actually been thinking about what I might say if given the opportunity, mentally composing stories about Marcus's childhood that would be both entertaining and heartfelt. But when I approached Brittany to ask about the speech schedule, her response was swift and definitive. "Oh, we're keeping the speeches very brief and limited," she said, consulting her tablet. "Just the maid of honor and best man. Vanessa wanted to keep things moving, you know? People get restless during long speeches, and we have a very tight timeline for the evening." I nodded and smiled, but something cold settled in my stomach. I thought about all the weddings I had attended over the years, about the tradition of parents speaking, about the opportunity to publicly welcome a new daughter and share the love I felt for my son. I thought about the speech I had been mentally crafting, the stories I wanted to tell, the blessing I wanted to offer. But more than that, I thought about what it meant to be told, without discussion or apology, that my voice wasn't needed, that my perspective wasn't valuable enough to warrant a few minutes of the carefully orchestrated evening. As the ceremony began, and I took my assigned seat in the third row, not the front row where the mother of the groom traditionally sat, but close enough to see clearly, I realized that this entire day had been designed without my input, planned around my absence rather than my inclusion. I was a necessary guest, required for the family photos and the head count, but not actually wanted as a participant in my own son's wedding. The ceremony itself was beautiful, I had to admit. Marcus looked handsome in his tailored suit, and Vanessa was radiant in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to be partners in adventure and growth, to support each other's dreams and ambitions, to build a life filled with love and laughter. But as I listened to their words, I noticed what wasn't mentioned. There was no acknowledgement of the families that had shaped them, no recognition of the love and sacrifice that had brought them to this moment, no gratitude for the people who had supported them along the way. Their vows existed in a bubble of the present tense, as if their love story had begun the day they met, and everything before that was merely prologue. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and the guests erupted in applause, I clapped along with everyone else, but I felt like I was celebrating something that belonged entirely to other people, something beautiful and joyful that had no real place for me beyond the role of polite observer. As we moved from the ceremony to the reception, as the evening continued to unfold according to Vanessa's perfectly planned schedule, I began to understand that this was more than just a wedding. This was a declaration of independence, a public statement that Marcus's new life would be built on Vanessa's terms, within Vanessa's vision, according to Vanessa's priorities. And I began to realize that I might have more power in this situation than anyone had bothered to consider. The reception hall at Shelburne Farms had been transformed into something that belonged in a bridal magazine. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory linens, each centerpiece a carefully arranged cascade of white roses and eucalyptus. The head table sat elevated on a small platform, decorated with additional flowers and soft lighting that would ensure perfect photographs. Everything was elegant, expensive, and utterly impersonal. I found my assigned seat at table 7, positioned strategically between Marcus's elderly great-aunt Dorothy, who was nearly deaf and hadn't recognized me during cocktails, and a young couple who introduced themselves as Vanessa's college friends from Boston. The table was far enough from the head table that I would need to crane my neck to see the speakers, close enough to the kitchen doors that I could hear the constant movement of catering staff preparing the next course. As guests settled into their seats and servers began delivering the first course, some kind of delicate fish preparation that looked more like art than food, I noticed the printed program at each place setting. The evening's timeline was laid out in elegant script. Cocktails, dinner, speeches from the maid of honor and best man, cake cutting, dancing. No mention of parent speeches, no opportunity for anyone outside the wedding party to share memories or offer blessings. Vanessa's maid of honor, a perfectly polished woman named Chelsea who worked in public relations, spoke first. Her speech was professional and entertaining, full of amusing anecdotes about college adventures and Vanessa's dating disasters before she met Marcus. She spoke about Vanessa's ambition, her loyalty, her ability to plan the perfect dinner party or navigate a complex work project with equal skill. The guests laughed in all the right places, and Chelsea concluded by raising her glass to the most organized, determined, and fabulous woman I know. The best man followed, Marcus's college roommate Jake, who had remained one of his closest friends despite living on the opposite coast. Jake's speech was more personal, sharing stories about Marcus that I hadn't heard before. He talked about late-night conversations in their dorm room, about Marcus's tendency to overthink every decision, about the way his face had lit up when he first started talking about Vanessa. But even Jake's stories seemed to begin with college, as if Marcus's life had started at 18, and everything before that was irrelevant to who he had become. I sat listening, my untouched wine glass growing warm in my hands, and felt the familiar ache of being edited out of my own son's story. There were no mentions of the values that had shaped him, no acknowledgement of the work ethic that had carried him through school, no recognition of the compassion that made him good at his job and faithful to his friendships. The Marcus they described was a complete person who had appeared fully formed in college, with no history, no foundation, no mother who had spent 2 decades teaching him how to be the man they were celebrating. When Jake finished his speech and the applause died down, I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced in years. The urgent need to speak, to claim space, to refuse to be invisible any longer. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stood up. Gurjan. The movement caught Brittany's attention immediately. She materialized beside my chair with the speed of someone trained to handle potential disruptions, her headset crackling with what I assumed were urgent communications about the unauthorized guest behavior at table 7. "Mrs. Roberts," she said in a low voice that carried the practiced calm of someone diffusing a situation. "The speech portion of the evening has concluded. We're moving directly to the cake-cutting ceremony." "I'd like to say a few words about my son," I replied, keeping my voice steady and polite, but not backing down. "I understand," Brittany said, though her expression suggested she understood this was a problem to be managed rather than a request to be honored. "But we're running on a very tight schedule, and Vanessa specifically requested that we keep the speeches brief and limited to the wedding party." Around me, I could feel the attention of nearby tables shifting in our direction. The conversation at table 7 had stopped entirely, and Great Aunt Dorothy was squinting at me with the kind of focused attention that suggested her hearing might be better than everyone assumed. At the head table, I could see Vanessa watching our exchange with barely concealed alarm, her hand resting on Marcus's arm in a way that looked supportive but seemed more like restraint. "I understand about the schedule," I said, still standing, still speaking in the calm voice I had perfected during 40 years of nursing. The voice that could deliver difficult news or manage family crises without adding to the chaos. "But I'm the mother of the groom. Traditionally, parents are given the opportunity to speak at their children's weddings." Brittany's smile became more strained, more professional. "Mrs. Roberts, I really appreciate your enthusiasm, but the timeline for this evening was carefully planned, and we simply don't have room for additional speeches. Perhaps you could share your thoughts privately with Marcus and Vanessa later?" The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Share my thoughts privately. Later. When the cameras were packed away and the guests had gone home, and the moment had passed into memory without my voice being part of it, when my words would be relegated to the category of things that happened after the real celebration ended, I looked across the room at Marcus, who was watching our interaction with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not embarrassment exactly, but something close to it. Something that suggested he wished I would sit down and let the evening proceed according to plan, that he would prefer not to deal with whatever complications my speaking might introduce. "How long would the speech need to be?" I asked Brittany, making one last attempt at compromise. "Mrs. Roberts," she said, and now her voice carried a note of finality that made it clear this conversation was over. We really need to move on to the cake cutting. Perhaps you could keep your remarks to a minute or two during the thank you portion at the end of the evening. A minute or two. At the end of the evening, when people were checking their phones and thinking about drive times and ready to move on to whatever came next. When my words would be a footnote to the real celebration, a brief interruption before everyone could get back to their lives. I sat down. The decision wasn't dramatic or defiant. I simply lowered myself back into my chair, smoothed my dusty rose dress, and picked up my wine glass. Brittany's relief was visible, and she moved away quickly, speaking into her headset about staying on schedule and proceeding to the next item on the timeline. But something had shifted inside me during that brief exchange. Something that had been dormant for years, perhaps decades, had awakened. I had spent so much of my life being accommodating, being flexible, being the kind of person who didn't make waves or create problems. I had raised a son while working full-time, managed a marriage and a career and a household without asking for help or recognition. I had built a successful business while maintaining the fiction that it was just a little hobby, just something to keep me busy in retirement. I had made myself small and quiet and manageable, and in return I had been treated as small and quiet and manageable. Hyatt. The cake cutting proceeded exactly as planned. Marcus and Vanessa posed for photographs, their hands joined on the silver knife, smiling at each other, and then at the crowd of guests who applauded on cue. The cake was beautiful. 3 tiers of white fondant decorated with sugar flowers that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. They fed each other small bites with the kind of calculated sweetness that would look perfect in the wedding album. And then servers appeared to slice and distribute pieces to the guests. I ate my cake mechanically, barely tasting the layers of vanilla and raspberry that I'm sure were delicious. Around me, conversations resumed, people moved between tables to greet friends and relatives, and the evening flowed forward with the smooth efficiency that Vanessa had paid so much to achieve. But I was no longer really present in the celebration. My mind had moved to other things, to conversations that would need to happen, and decisions that would need to be made. I thought about the Pine Street apartment, sitting empty and ready for Marcus and Vanessa's arrival. I thought about the lease agreement I had drafted but not yet signed, the document that would govern their living situation for the next year. Most landlords use standard lease agreements, generic forms downloaded from the internet, or provided by property management companies. But I had always preferred to draft my own leases, tailored to each property and situation. It gave me more control over the terms, more flexibility to address specific circumstances, more protection for both my interests and my tenants' rights. The lease I had prepared for Marcus and Vanessa was generous in every way. 12 months starting the week after their honeymoon, renewable by mutual agreement, rent set below market value because they were family, no security deposit required, permission to paint and make minor modifications, use of the garden space and storage in the basement, even a clause allowing them to terminate early, with 60 days' notice if Marcus's job situation changed or if they decided to move to Boston sooner than planned. I had spent hours crafting language that would protect them while being fair to me, anticipating potential issues and addressing them before they became problems. The lease was a reflection of my hopes for our relationship over the coming year. Flexible, generous, built on trust and mutual respect. But, sitting in that reception hall, watching my son celebrate his new life with a woman who had systematically excluded me from every meaningful moment of their wedding day, I began to reconsider some of those generous terms. The lease was still sitting on my kitchen table at home, unsigned and unexecuted. Until both parties signed and dated the document, it was just a draft, a proposal, a possibility that could be modified or withdrawn entirely. As the evening wore on, as dancing began and the celebration continued around me, I found myself thinking less about the speech I hadn't been allowed to give and more about the power I hadn't yet exercised. Vanessa had controlled every aspect of this wedding, had managed every detail to ensure that everything proceeded exactly according to her vision. She had treated me like an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be included, like a problem to be solved rather than a family member to be welcomed. But in her careful planning and meticulous control, she had overlooked one crucial detail. She had forgotten that some relationships couldn't be managed with timelines and talking points, that some people had resources and influence, that extended beyond their ability to give speeches at wedding receptions. She had forgotten that I owned the apartment where she planned to start her married life, and that ownership came with certain privileges that couldn't be coordinated by a wedding planner or managed by someone with a headset and a clipboard. I stayed until the end of the reception, smiling politely and making small talk with relatives I saw once a year. I danced once with Marcus during the father-daughter, mother-son dance portion of the evening, swaying to a song I didn't recognize, while he made stilted conversation about how beautiful everything looked and how happy he was. "I'm sorry you didn't get to speak," he said as the song ended, his words rushed and slightly awkward. "It's fine," I replied, and I meant it. Sometimes the most important conversations happen away from microphones. He looked confused by my response, but before he could ask what I meant, Vanessa appeared to reclaim him for more photographs, more obligations, more items on the timeline that needed to be completed before the evening could officially end. I retrieved my coat from the check, said my goodbyes to the relatives and family friends I would probably not see again until the next wedding or funeral, and drove home through the Vermont darkness with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The lease agreement was still on my kitchen table where I had left it that morning, next to the welcome basket I had prepared for their arrival. I sat down with a cup of tea and read through the document again, this time not as a generous mother-in-law, but as a businesswoman who had spent 20 years learning that the terms of any agreement matter more than the goodwill of the people who sign it. It was time to make some revisions. I spent the 3 days following the wedding in a state of focused calm that reminded me of my nursing days, when emergency situations required clear thinking and decisive action without the luxury of prolonged deliberation. The lease agreement sat on my kitchen table like a puzzle I was determined to solve, each clause and provision becoming a tool I could use to reshape the power dynamic that had been so thoroughly demonstrated at the reception. The original lease had been 12 pages of generous terms and flexible conditions. By Tuesday morning, it had grown to 18 pages of meticulously crafted language that would have made Theodore proud. He had always admired precision in business dealings, the way a well-written contract could prevent misunderstandings and protect everyone involved. "The devil is in the details, Emily," he used to say when reviewing our property investments, "and so is the protection." I rewrote the lease term first. Instead of 12 months renewable by mutual agreement, the new version specified a 6-month initial term with renewal contingent upon landlord approval and satisfactory performance of all lease obligations. It was perfectly legal. Vermont law allowed landlords considerable discretion in lease renewals, especially for properties under 4 units. But it fundamentally altered the security that Marcus and Vanessa had been counting on. The rent adjustment came next. I researched comparable properties in Burlington, spent hours on real estate websites and rental platforms, and discovered that my original offer had been significantly below market rate. The new lease reflected current market conditions, representing an increase of $600 per month. Still fair, still competitive, but no longer the family discount I had planned to offer. But the most creative changes involved the behavioral clauses and usage restrictions. Every lease I had ever written included standard provisions about noise levels, guest policies, and property maintenance. The new version expanded these considerably. The noise ordinance clause now specified quiet hours from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., with particular attention to activities that might disturb neighbors. Any violations would result in written warnings, with 3 warnings triggering lease termination proceedings. I included specific language about vocal disturbances and amplified speech, thinking about how Vanessa's voice carried when she was excited or planning something, how she had dominated every conversation I'd witnessed. The guest policy became equally detailed. Overnight visitors required 48 hours advance notice to the landlord. Social gatherings of more than 6 people required written permission and a $50 cleaning deposit. Any events involving catering or professional photography needed additional approval and insurance documentation. I thought about Vanessa's binder full of plans, her love of entertaining and documenting every moment, and crafted language that would make spontaneous celebrations nearly impossible. The property modification clause eliminated their permission to paint or make changes without detailed written proposals, submitted 30 days in advance. Any modifications would need to be professionally executed and subject to landlord inspection. At the end of the lease term, all changes would need to be restored to original condition at tenant expense, regardless of whether the modifications were considered improvements. I added maintenance responsibility clauses that shifted typical landlord obligations to the tenants. Snow removal from walkways and driveways became their responsibility. Lawn care and garden maintenance were now included in their duties. Any repairs under $200 would be handled at tenant expense, with documentation required for all work performed. The most satisfying addition was the early termination clause. While my original draft had allowed them to leave with 60 days' notice, the new version eliminated that option entirely. Early termination would only be permitted in cases of job relocation, more than 50 miles from Burlington, with documentation from employers and 60 days written notice, plus forfeiture of last month's rent and a termination fee equal to 2 months' rent. But my masterpiece was the communication protocol section. All requests, complaints, or notifications to the landlord needed to be submitted in writing during normal business hours. Phone calls would only be accepted for genuine emergencies involving property damage or safety concerns. Routine maintenance requests required detailed descriptions, photographs when applicable, and acknowledgement that non-emergency items would be addressed within 30 days of written notice. I thought about Vanessa's efficiency, her love of immediate responses and carefully managed timelines. The communication clause would force her to slow down, to document everything, to wait for responses according to my schedule, rather than her urgency. By Wednesday afternoon, I had created a lease agreement that was completely legal, entirely enforceable, and designed to make their lives as complicated as they had made mine feel at the wedding. Every clause was defensible. Every restriction had precedent in standard rental agreements. Every modification reflected legitimate landlord concerns about property protection and tenant responsibility. The document looked professional and reasonable on the surface. A casual reader might notice it was more detailed than typical leases, but nothing appeared punitive or unfair. Only someone who actually had to live under these terms would discover how the accumulated weight of small restrictions and bureaucratic requirements could make daily life feel like navigating an obstacle course. I printed the final version on my good letterhead, the cream-colored paper with raised text that I used for important business correspondence. I prepared 2 copies for signing, along with a cover letter explaining that I had, quote, updated the lease terms to reflect current market conditions and ensure clarity for all parties involved. Thursday morning brought a phone call from Marcus. He and Vanessa had returned from their honeymoon in Tuscany. 5 days of wine tours and cooking classes that had filled Vanessa's social media with professionally photographed moments of marital bliss. They were eager to see the apartment and finalize the lease so they could begin settling into their new life in Vermont. "We can't wait to get started," Marcus said, his voice carrying the relaxed happiness of someone fresh from vacation. Vanessa has already been researching furniture stores and planning how to decorate. She found this amazing local artist who does custom wallpaper, and she's thinking about commissioning something for the bedroom. I made appropriate sounds of interest while mentally reviewing the property modification clause that would require a 30-day written proposal and professional installation documentation for any wallpaper installation. "That sounds lovely," I said. "Why don't you both come by tomorrow afternoon to look at the apartment and review the lease? I'll have everything ready for you." "Perfect," Marcus replied. "Vanessa is so excited to finally sign and make it official. She's been calling it, quote, our first real home all week." After we hung up, I spent the rest of Thursday preparing the apartment for their visit. I cleaned surfaces that were already spotless, arranged fresh flowers in the living room, and made sure every detail would create the impression of a perfect home waiting for perfect tenants. I wanted them to fall in love with the space before they saw the terms that would govern their life in it. Friday afternoon arrived with unusually warm October weather, the kind of Indian summer day that made Vermont feel like a secret everyone should discover. Marcus and Vanessa pulled into the Pine Street driveway precisely on time, stepping out of Marcus's car with the coordinated efficiency of people who had spent their honeymoon perfecting the art of being a couple. Vanessa looked radiant in the way that new wives often do, her skin glowing from Italian sun and her hair styled in loose waves that suggested effortless beauty achieved through considerable effort. She wore white jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. and she moved with the confident energy of someone whose life was proceeding exactly according to plan. "Emily," she called out, walking toward me with arms extended for what appeared to be our first genuine hug. "Thank you so much for making this possible. We are absolutely thrilled about living here." Marcus followed behind her, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the kind of relaxed smile I hadn't seen from him in months. "Mom, you should see the photos Vanessa took in Italy. She has such an eye for beauty. She's going to transform this place into something amazing." I hugged them both and accepted the wine, a bottle of Chianti Classico that they had brought back from a vineyard tour, while feeling a strange mixture of affection and anticipation. These were good people, I reminded myself. My son and his new wife, starting their marriage with hope and excitement and plans for a beautiful future. The fact that they had excluded me from their wedding celebration didn't make them villains, just thoughtless in the way that young people often are when they're focused on their own happiness. But thoughtlessness had consequences. And sometimes those consequences arrived, wrapped in legal documents and signed with fountain pens. "Let's look at the apartment first," I suggested, leading them toward the entrance. "I want you to see everything in the afternoon light. It really shows off the space beautifully." The tour went exactly as I had hoped. Vanessa gasped with delight at the exposed brick walls, ran her hands along the restored hardwood floors, and immediately began planning aloud where furniture would go and how she would arrange the space. She took dozens of photos with her phone, already envisioning the Instagram posts that would document their charming Vermont life. Marcus was quieter but equally pleased, commenting on the crown molding and the updated kitchen appliances, asking practical questions about heating costs and parking arrangements. He seemed genuinely happy to be back in Vermont, closer to his childhood home, though I noticed he was careful not to make any assumptions about how much time we would spend together. After the tour, we settled at the small dining table in my house to review the lease. I served coffee and the cookies I had baked that morning, creating the kind of domestic atmosphere that would make the business portion of our meeting feel like a family discussion rather than a formal negotiation. "I've updated the lease since our last conversation," I explained, sliding copies across the table to each of them. I wanted to make sure all the terms were clear, and that we covered everything properly. Vanessa immediately began flipping through the pages, her expression shifting from casual interest to focused attention as she absorbed the document's length and detail. Marcus picked up his copy more slowly, trusting that whatever his mother had prepared would be fair and straightforward. "Wow," Vanessa said after a few minutes of reading. "This is quite comprehensive." "I believe in being thorough," I replied, pouring more coffee and maintaining the pleasant tone of someone discussing routine business. Clear expectations prevent misunderstandings later. They read in silence for several minutes, occasionally glancing at each other when they encountered particular clauses or restrictions. I watched their faces carefully, noting the moment when Marcus's expression shifted from casual approval to confused concern, the instant when Vanessa realized that this lease was nothing like what they had been expecting. The afternoon light slanted through my kitchen windows, creating patterns on the table where three people sat reading different versions of the same future, each of us understanding something the others had yet to discover about the terms that would govern the next 6 months of all our lives. The silence that settled over my kitchen table was the kind that precedes storms. Vanessa had stopped turning pages halfway through the lease, her manicured finger tracing particular clauses while her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. Marcus was still reading, his brow furrowed in the way it used to get when he was struggling with homework problems that seemed more complicated than they should be. "Emily," Vanessa said finally, her voice carefully controlled in the way people speak when they're trying not to lose their temper. "Some of these terms seem quite extensive." I sipped my coffee and nodded pleasantly. "Rental agreements have become much more detailed over the years. It protects everyone involved." "But a $50 deposit for having more than 6 people over?" Vanessa's finger tapped against the guest policy section. "That seems excessive for a simple dinner party." "Insurance concerns," I replied smoothly. "You'd be surprised how quickly costs can add up when multiple people are using a property. The deposit ensures any additional cleaning or minor damages are covered." Marcus looked up from his copy, and I could see him trying to process what he was reading. "Mom, this rent amount, it's significantly higher than what we discussed." I researched current market rates, I explained. The original amount I quoted was based on outdated information. This reflects what comparable properties are actually renting for in Burlington right now. That was true, technically. I had indeed researched market rates extensively. What I didn't mention was that the properties commanding these prices typically included amenities like parking garages, fitness centers, or luxury finishes that the Pine Street apartment didn't offer. Vanessa had resumed reading, her attention now focused on the noise restrictions and communication protocols. It says here that all communication with the landlord must be in writing during business hours. What if there's an emergency? The clause specifically exempts genuine emergencies involving property damage or safety concerns, I pointed out. But experience has taught me that most urgent issues can wait for proper documentation. It prevents misunderstandings and ensures everything is handled professionally. I watched as they exchanged glances across the table, one of those wordless marital communications that new couples think they've invented. Marcus's look said, "This seems extreme, but she's my mother and I don't want to cause problems." Vanessa's expression was harder to read, but I detected the calculation of someone trying to decide whether to confront an uncomfortable situation directly, or find a way around it. "The early termination clause," Marcus said, his voice careful and diplomatic. "It's quite restrictive. What if circumstances change?" "What circumstances are you anticipating?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You've told me this arrangement is exactly what you want. A chance to experience Vermont life, to be closer to family, to start your marriage somewhere with character and charm." "Of course," Vanessa interjected quickly. "We're absolutely committed to staying for the full term. It's just that most leases include some flexibility for unexpected situations." "Most tenants aren't family," I replied. "I'm offering you a beautiful apartment in an excellent location at a competitive rate. In return, I need assurance that you're serious about this commitment. The early termination restrictions protect my interests as a landlord, while ensuring you have the stable housing situation you've requested." Marcus was studying the property modifications section now, his confusion evident. "It says here that any changes to the apartment need 30 days written notice and professional installation documentation. Even painting?" "Even painting," I confirmed. You'd be amazed how often tenants think they're improving a property when they're actually creating expensive restoration issues. This clause ensures that any modifications are done properly and won't require costly repairs later. Vanessa's phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced at it automatically before returning her attention to the lease. "The maintenance clause shifts quite a bit of responsibility to us. Snow removal, lawn care, minor repairs under $200. Standard practice for single-family rentals," I said, which was stretching the truth, but not technically false. "It keeps costs down for everyone and ensures the property is maintained to your standards, rather than waiting for landlord response times." "But we're not renting a single-family home," Marcus pointed out. "It's an apartment. An apartment in a converted house with its own entrance, garden access, and private outdoor space," I clarified. "The maintenance responsibilities reflect the additional amenities you'll be enjoying." Vanessa closed her copy of the lease and leaned back in her chair, her posture suggesting she was preparing for a different kind of conversation. "Emily, can I ask you something directly?" "Of course. Are you angry about something? About the wedding, perhaps?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could feel Marcus tense beside her, could see him preparing to mediate whatever conflict might be brewing. This was the moment I had been anticipating since I started rewriting the lease, the moment when the subtext became text and we all stopped pretending this was just business. "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it. Anger was hot and impulsive and unproductive. What I felt was cooler, more purposeful. "I'm simply being realistic about business relationships and personal expectations." "What does that mean?" Marcus asked. I set down my coffee cup and folded my hands on the table, choosing my words carefully. "At your wedding, I learned something important about how I fit into your new life together. I learned about boundaries and priorities and the importance of staying in my designated role." "Mom," Marcus started, but I held up a gentle hand. "Please, let me finish. Vanessa has been very clear about her vision for your marriage, about the kind of life she wants to build with you. That vision doesn't include much space for input from me, and I respect that. The wedding made your preferences very clear. Controlled, professional, efficiently managed. Vanessa's cheeks had flushed slightly, but she maintained eye contact. I don't understand what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. You planned a beautiful wedding according to your exact specifications. You managed every detail to ensure nothing unexpected would interfere with your vision. You made it clear that my role was to attend quietly and not take up space or time that belonged to other people. That's not, Vanessa began, but I continued speaking. This lease reflects the same approach. Clear boundaries, specific expectations, professional management of our relationship. You've shown me how you prefer to handle family interactions, and I'm simply applying those same principles to our business arrangement. Marcus looked stricken. Mom, if you felt left out at the wedding, we should talk about that. But this lease, these terms, are perfectly legal and entirely reasonable, I finished. They reflect current market conditions and standard landlord protections. Everything you see here is designed to ensure clarity and prevent misunderstandings, just like your wedding timeline. Vanessa's composure was starting to crack slightly. This feels punitive. Business often feels impersonal when you're used to special treatment, I replied. But you've made it clear that you prefer professional boundaries over family informality. The lease simply provides the structure you seem to value. We were counting on this apartment, Marcus said quietly. We've already made arrangements, told people we were moving to Vermont. And you still can if you're willing to accept the terms. The apartment is beautiful, the location is excellent, and the rent is competitive with similar properties. You'll have exactly what you wanted: independence, privacy, and a landlord who respects boundaries. I could see them trying to process the situation, trying to figure out how a simple lease signing had become this complicated emotional negotiation. Vanessa was clearly calculating whether they could afford the higher rent and whether the restrictions would be tolerable. Marcus was torn between loyalty to his wife and some dawning understanding that his treatment of me had consequences. Can we have some time to think about this? Vanessa asked finally. Of course. But I should mention that I have another couple interested in the apartment. They're coming to look at it tomorrow afternoon. That was a lie, but a strategic one. I had learned from years of property management that artificial scarcity often clarified people's priorities more effectively than lengthy negotiations. Another couple? Marcus looked surprised. A young professional couple from Montreal. They're relocating for work and need housing immediately. They've already indicated they're prepared to sign a lease this weekend if the apartment meets their needs. Vanessa's business instincts kicked in immediately. What are their terms? Standard market rate, 12-month lease, no special accommodations. Another lie, but delivered with the calm confidence of someone stating obvious facts. They sat in silence for several minutes, both of them undoubtedly running calculations in their heads. The rent increase would strain their budget but not break it. The restrictions were annoying, but not impossible to live with. The alternative, finding another apartment in Burlington with this much character at any price, would be difficult and time-consuming. If we sign today, Vanessa said slowly, would you be willing to negotiate any of the terms? Which terms specifically? The guest policy deposit, maybe, and the early termination clause. I pretended to consider this, taking time to finish my coffee while they waited for my response. I could reduce the guest deposit to $25, I said finally. But the early termination clause protects my interests as much as yours. If you're truly committed to staying, it shouldn't be a concern. Marcus and Vanessa exchanged another look, this one longer and more complex. I could see them weighing options, calculating costs, trying to decide whether to accept terms they found unreasonable or walk away from an apartment they genuinely wanted. We need to discuss this privately, Marcus said finally. Of course. Why don't you take a walk around the neighborhood while you talk? You can see the area, get a feel for the community. I'll be here when you're ready to let me know your decision. They left their copies of the lease on the table and went outside, walking slowly down Pine Street while engaging in what was clearly an intense conversation. I watched them from my kitchen window, noting their body language, the way Vanessa gestured emphatically while Marcus listened with his hands in his pockets. I used their absence to review my own emotions, checking for any signs of guilt or regret about the position I had put them in. But I felt only a calm satisfaction, the kind of clarity that comes from finally acting according to your own interests, instead of constantly accommodating other people's needs. They had taught me at their wedding that relationships could be managed, like business transactions, that family members could be assigned roles and expected to perform them without complaint. Now they were learning that this approach worked both ways, that the person they had treated as a bit player in their story might actually hold more power than they had realized. When they returned 30 minutes later, their faces told me everything I needed to know about their decision before either of them spoke. When Marcus and Vanessa returned from their walk, their body language told a story of compromise and reluctant acceptance. Vanessa walked slightly ahead, her jaw set in the determined expression of someone who had lost a negotiation but wasn't ready to admit defeat. Marcus followed a half-step behind, his shoulders carrying the weight of someone caught between competing loyalties and finding no comfortable position. They settled back at my kitchen table with the careful movements of people approaching a situation they couldn't fully control. The lease documents still lay spread between us like a map of territory we were all trying to navigate. "We've decided to accept the terms," Vanessa announced, her voice carrying the crisp professionalism she probably used in difficult client meetings. "With the guest deposit reduced to $25, as you mentioned." "Wonderful," I replied, reaching for my pen. "I think you'll be very happy in the apartment." But Marcus wasn't quite ready to move forward. "Mom, before we sign anything, I need to ask you directly. Is this about the wedding? About the speech situation?" The question deserved an honest answer, even if honesty came wrapped in careful phrasing. "This is about understanding boundaries and expectations," I said. "The wedding taught me that you both value clear structure and professional management of relationships. This lease simply applies those same principles to our business arrangement." "That's not the same thing," Marcus pressed. "You're upset because Vanessa's coordinator didn't let you speak." "I'm not upset, Marcus. I'm educated. There's a difference between emotional reactions and informed responses." Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her expression sharpening. "What do you mean by informed responses?" "I mean that actions have consequences, and choices reveal priorities. At your wedding, you made choices about who mattered enough to speak, who deserved prominent seating, who should be included in planning conversations. Those choices informed me about how you view my role in your lives." "You're our family," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "This apartment arrangement was supposed to bring us closer together." "And it will," I agreed, "within appropriate boundaries and clear expectations. You'll have your independence, I'll have my professional protections, and we'll all know exactly where we stand." Vanessa was studying me with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a complex problem. "You're teaching us a lesson. I'm offering you a rental agreement that reflects fair market terms and standard landlord protections. If you see a lesson in that, perhaps it's one worth learning." The dance of words continued for several more minutes, each of us saying things that meant more than their surface content. Marcus tried to bridge the gap between family sentiment and business reality. Vanessa pushed for better terms while maintaining her dignity. I remained consistently pleasant and implacable, offering no ground while appearing entirely reasonable. Finally, they signed. 2 copies, witnessed and dated, with Vanessa's signature particularly crisp and controlled, as if she were signing a treaty rather than a lease. Marcus's signature was less certain, more hesitant, the handwriting of someone still hoping this might somehow turn out differently than it appeared. "The first month's rent and security deposit," I said, sliding an invoice across the table. "Due before move-in, as specified in the lease." Vanessa pulled out her checkbook, actual paper checks, which seemed quaintly formal for someone her age, and wrote out the amount with sharp, precise strokes. The check represented nearly $3,000, significantly more than they had budgeted for, and I could see her calculating the impact on their other plans. "When can we start moving in?" Marcus asked. "Next weekend, as planned. I'll have the keys ready Friday afternoon." We spent a few more minutes reviewing practical details, utility transfers, parking arrangements, the contact information for submitting written maintenance requests. Everything was cordial and professional, the kind of interaction between a competent landlord and cooperative tenants who understood their respective roles. But underneath the surface politeness, we all knew that something fundamental had shifted. The relationship between us would never again operate on the casual assumptions of family affection. Every interaction would now be filtered through the terms of a legal document that favored my interests and constrained their freedom. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Not vindictive pleasure, exactly, but the quiet contentment that comes from finally asserting yourself after years of accommodation. I had spent decades putting other people's comfort ahead of my own needs, smoothing over conflicts rather than addressing them, accepting less than I deserved because asking for more seemed selfish or demanding. The wedding had been a wake-up call, a demonstration that my willingness to step aside and stay quiet had been interpreted as permission to ignore me entirely. Vanessa had managed me like a potential problem rather than welcoming me as family, and Marcus had allowed it to happen because my silence made his life easier. But silence could be a choice rather than a default, and sometimes the most powerful response to being overlooked was to demonstrate exactly how much attention you actually deserved. The next 6 months would teach them both that the woman they had dismissed as a quiet mother figure was actually a skilled businesswoman who understood leverage, contracts, and the art of polite but implacable enforcement of her own interests. I spent the following week preparing for their arrival with the same attention to detail that Vanessa had applied to her wedding planning. I documented the apartment's condition with photographs from every angle, noting the smallest scratches or imperfections that might become issues later. I researched snow removal companies and lawn care services, gathering contact information that I could provide when they asked about fulfilling their maintenance obligations. Most importantly, I established the communication protocols that would govern our landlord-tenant relationship. I set up a dedicated email address for all lease-related correspondence, programmed to send automatic replies acknowledging receipt and informing senders that all requests would be addressed within the timeframe specified in their lease agreement. I purchased a separate phone line for property management calls, with a voicemail message explaining that non-emergency issues should be submitted in writing during business hours. Every system I created was designed to mirror the formal, managed approach they had used for their wedding. If they valued efficiency and clear boundaries, I would give them efficiency and clear boundaries in abundance. Marcus called twice during that week, ostensibly to ask practical questions about move-in logistics, but clearly hoping to restore some warmth to our interactions. I answered his questions helpfully and professionally, providing all the information he needed while maintaining the slightly distant tone of a competent service provider. "Mom," he said during the second call, "this feels strange, like we're strangers doing business instead of family helping each other." "Business relationships often feel more formal than personal ones," I replied. "But they're also clearer and more predictable. Everyone knows what to expect." "Is this how it's going to be from now on, this formal distance?" "This is how landlord-tenant relationships work, Marcus. It protects everyone involved and prevents misunderstandings." "But you're not just our landlord, you're my mother. And you're not just my tenant, you're my son." "But we've learned that family relationships can benefit from the same clear boundaries that make business relationships successful." I could hear his frustration in the silence that followed, his struggle to find words that might restore the easier dynamic we had once shared. But the easier dynamic had been based on my willingness to accept whatever level of inclusion I was offered, and I was no longer willing to accept so little. Moving day arrived with the crisp efficiency of a well-executed plan. Marcus and Vanessa showed up with a rental truck and a team of friends who made quick work of transferring boxes and furniture from the truck to the apartment. I watched from my front porch, noting their careful handling of my property, their obvious excitement about settling into their new home. Vanessa had already begun the transformation she had envisioned, arranging furniture to maximize the apartment's charm and setting up carefully curated displays that would photograph well for her social media documentation of their Vermont life. She moved through the space with the confidence of someone claiming territory, making it hers through the deliberate placement of objects and the systematic organization of their belongings. Marcus seemed more tentative, perhaps still processing the change in our relationship, or perhaps simply overwhelmed by the logistics of establishing a new household. He glanced toward my house occasionally, and I wondered if he was hoping for some gesture of welcome that would signal a return to easier family dynamics. But I remained on my porch, observing rather than participating, helpful when asked direct questions but careful not to overstep the boundaries that had been so clearly established. They had taught me that my role was to provide services when requested, rather than offering unsolicited assistance or inserting myself into situations where I hadn't been explicitly invited. By evening, they were settled enough to order pizza and sit on their small back patio to admire their first sunset in Vermont. I could hear their voices through my kitchen window as they made plans for the coming weeks: furniture shopping trips, restaurant explorations, the gradual establishment of routines that would make Burlington feel like home. They sounded happy, optimistic about their new adventure. And I was genuinely glad for their happiness, even as I looked forward to teaching them that some adventures come with more complications than others, and that the most challenging lessons often arrive wrapped in perfectly legal, entirely reasonable, completely enforceable packages. The first test of our new dynamic would come sooner than any of us expected, triggered by something as simple as a dinner party and a misunderstanding about noise ordinances. But that was still several days away, and for now, I was content to sit in my own kitchen, sipping tea and listening to the sounds of my son and his wife beginning their married life according to terms I had written and they had agreed to follow. Sometimes the most satisfying victories were the ones that looked like ordinary business transactions, the kind that left everyone technically satisfied while subtly shifting the balance of power in ways that wouldn't become apparent until much later. The first 3 weeks of Marcus and Vanessa's tenancy passed with deceptive tranquility. They settled into their routines with the enthusiasm of newlyweds discovering domestic life together. Morning coffee on the back patio, evening walks through the neighborhood, weekend trips to farmers markets and antique shops. From my kitchen window, I could observe their movements without appearing to monitor them, noting their schedules and habits with the casual attention of someone who happened to live nearby. Vanessa had quickly established a home office in the smaller bedroom, transforming it into a sophisticated workspace with a standing desk, professional lighting for video calls, and a backdrop of carefully arranged books and plants that would look impressive during virtual meetings. She maintained her Boston work schedule, starting early and often working late into the evening, her voice occasionally audible through the shared wall when she was on important calls. Marcus had found a rhythm that involved leaving for his temporary consulting work in Montpelier each morning and returning by early evening, usually carrying groceries or takeout containers that suggested they were still in the honeymoon phase of not wanting to cook elaborate meals. He seemed genuinely happy to be back in Vermont, reconnecting with old friends and rediscovering the outdoor activities that had filled his childhood weekends. They were model tenants in most respects: quiet, clean, prompt with their rent payment, careful about following the basic rules that governed apartment living. But model tenants, I had learned over 20 years of property management, could still create significant problems through simple misunderstandings about boundaries and expectations. The first test came on a Thursday evening in early November. I was reading in my living room when I became aware of voices from the direction of their apartment. Not loud, exactly, but more numerous than usual. Through my front window, I could see additional cars parked along Pine Street, and the warm glow from their windows suggested they were entertaining guests. A dinner party, I realized. Nothing dramatic or disruptive, just the kind of social gathering that young couples hosted to establish themselves in a new community. Under normal circumstances, it would have been exactly the kind of activity I'd encourage in tenants, building relationships, integrating into the neighborhood, creating the kind of positive presence that made properties more desirable. But these weren't normal circumstances, and I wasn't just any landlord. I waited until 9:15, exactly 15 minutes past the quiet hours specified in their lease, before walking across the yard to their door. The sounds of conversation and laughter were clearly audible from the sidewalk, accompanied by music and the clink of glasses that suggested a gathering larger than the 6-person maximum specified in their guest policy. I knocked gently, the kind of polite tap that wouldn't alarm anyone but would get attention from people who were listening. Marcus answered, wearing a casual sweater and carrying a wine glass, his face flushed with the warmth of good company and successful entertaining. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying surprise and what might have been slight concern. "Is everything okay?" "I hope so," I replied pleasantly. "I'm just checking on the noise level. It's after 9, and I want to make sure we're not disturbing the neighbors." Behind him, I could see into their living room where 8 or 9 people were scattered around the space. Some sitting on the couch, others standing near the kitchen island, all of them looking like exactly the kind of young professionals Vanessa would befriend. The apartment looked beautiful. decorated with fresh flowers and lit by candles that created an atmosphere of sophisticated warmth. "Oh," Marcus said, glancing back toward his guests and then at his watch. "I didn't realize it was past 9. We've just been having dinner with some of Vanessa's new colleagues. I can ask everyone to keep it down." "That would be helpful," I agreed. "Also, I noticed there are more than 6 guests, which triggers the event deposit requirement we discussed in the lease." Vanessa appeared behind Marcus, drawn by our conversation and clearly trying to assess the situation. "Emily, how nice to see you. Would you like to come in for a drink? I'd love you to meet everyone." The invitation was gracious and appeared genuine, but it also served as a deflection from the lease violation discussion. "That's very kind," I said, "but I don't want to interrupt your evening. I'm just here to discuss the guest policy." "Guest policy?" Vanessa's expression shifted slightly, moving from social hostess to problem-solving mode. "More than 6 guests requires advance notice and a cleaning deposit," I explained, maintaining my pleasant tone. "It's in Section 4 of your lease agreement." Marcus looked genuinely confused. "But it's just a dinner party. We're not causing any damage." "I'm sure you're not. But the policy exists to protect the property and ensure additional cleaning costs are covered when larger groups use the space. The deposit is $50, refundable after inspection." I could see Vanessa calculating quickly, trying to decide whether to pay the deposit, argue the policy, or ask their guests to leave immediately. The social embarrassment of any of these options was clearly weighing against her desire to maintain control of the situation. "We weren't aware that 8 people would trigger the policy," she said carefully. "Can we pay the deposit now and get proper notice for future gatherings?" "Of course. Cash or check is fine, and I can provide you with the guest notification form for future events." The transaction that followed was awkward in exactly the way I had anticipated. Vanessa had to excuse herself from her own dinner party to find her checkbook, explain the situation to her guests without making me sound unreasonable, and write a check for $50 while maintaining her composure as a gracious hostess. Marcus hovered anxiously between supporting his wife and managing his relationship with me, clearly uncomfortable with the formality of the interaction, but unsure how to address it without making things worse. "There," Vanessa said, handing me the check with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Will that take care of everything?" "Almost. I'll also need the contact information for your guests, as specified in the lease, and confirmation that the gathering will conclude by 10:30 to comply with the quiet hours provision." "Contact information?" Marcus looked baffled. "Why do you need our friends' names?" "Liability protection. If there's any property damage or incident, I need to know who was present. It's standard practice for properties with event policies." Vanessa's hostess smile was becoming more strained by the moment. "Emily, I have 8 professional colleagues in my living room. Asking for their personal information seems excessive." "I understand it's inconvenient," I replied, "but the lease you signed requires compliance with these policies. I'm simply enforcing the terms we all agreed to." The standoff that followed was brief but educational for everyone involved. Vanessa could refuse to provide the information, but that would constitute a lease violation. She could ask her guests to leave immediately, but that would ruin her carefully planned evening. Or she could comply with the requirements and deal with the embarrassment of explaining to her colleagues why their names and phone numbers were needed for a dinner party. She chose compliance, but the cost was visible in her tight smile and measured words as she returned to her guests to collect the required information. I waited on the doorstep, professional and patient, while she managed the awkward explanations and gathered the details I had requested. Marcus stayed with me during this process, his discomfort evident in the way he shifted from foot to foot and avoided meeting my eyes. "Mom, this feels really formal for a family situation." "This is a landlord-tenant situation," I corrected gently. "The formality protects everyone's interests and ensures clear communication." "But we're family. We're family members who also have a business relationship. It's important to keep those roles separate." When Vanessa returned with a list of names and phone numbers, her composure was intact but clearly required effort to maintain. "Here's the information you requested. Is there anything else?" "Just confirmation that the gathering will conclude by 10:30, as required for compliance with quiet hours." "It will," she said, "though though I could see her mentally calculating how to politely encourage 8 dinner guests to leave within the next hour. Wonderful. I'll return the cleaning deposit once I've had a chance to inspect the common areas tomorrow. Have a lovely evening. I walked back to my house, leaving them to manage the remainder of their dinner party within the constraints I had just imposed. Through my kitchen window, I could see the subtle changes in the gathering. Conversations becoming more hurried, guests beginning to collect their coats. The efficient but slightly flustered process of concluding a social event earlier than anyone had planned. The apartment was completely quiet by 10:45. The next morning, I performed the inspection that would determine whether their cleaning deposit was refundable. I found the apartment in excellent condition. Floors swept, surfaces cleaned, no evidence of damage or excessive wear from the previous evening's gathering. Vanessa had clearly spent considerable time after her guests left ensuring everything met acceptable standards. I wrote her a check for $50 and delivered it with a note, thanking them for their compliance with lease policies and their careful attention to property maintenance. Professional courtesy with a subtle reminder that future compliance was expected. The incident had accomplished exactly what I had intended. Marcus and Vanessa now understood that their lease agreement wasn't a symbolic document, but a set of enforceable requirements that would be consistently applied. They had learned that my role as their landlord took precedence over my relationship as Marcus's mother when it came to property management issues. Most importantly, they had experienced the kind of managed, controlled interaction that they had favored for their wedding. Every aspect of their dinner party had ultimately been subject to my approval, my policies, my schedule. They had been forced to operate within constraints imposed by someone else, to modify their plans according to requirements they hadn't fully anticipated. The power dynamic in our relationship had shifted, quietly but unmistakably. They were learning that the woman they had relegated to a minor role in their wedding celebration was actually someone whose approval they now needed for the basic activities of daily life. And this was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, I found numerous opportunities to enforce the lease provisions with the same calm professionalism I had demonstrated during the dinner party incident. A maintenance request that wasn't submitted during business hours was returned with instructions about proper communication protocols. A question about painting the bedroom wall required a 30-day written proposal with paint samples and contractor estimates. A request to install a small shelf in the bathroom needed landlord approval and documentation about wall anchoring methods. Each interaction was perfectly reasonable, entirely legal, and completely consistent with the lease they had signed. But the cumulative effect was to make their daily lives subject to constant small negotiations and bureaucratic processes that reminded them, again and again, who actually controlled their living situation. They were beginning to understand what I had learned at their wedding, that the person who sets the rules and controls the schedule holds all the real power, regardless of the polite fictions that everyone else agrees to maintain. By February, the psychological weight of living under constant scrutiny had begun to show in ways that even Vanessa's practiced composure couldn't entirely conceal. I observed the changes from my kitchen window and during our increasingly frequent lease-related interactions, the way her shoulders carried tension that hadn't been there in October, how Marcus's easy laughter had become more forced and less frequent, the subtle signs of strain that accumulated when every aspect of daily life required navigation through bureaucratic procedures. The January rent payment had arrived 3 days late due to a banking error, triggering the late fee provision I had carefully written into their lease. The $50 penalty was modest compared to their monthly expenses, but the principle was absolute. Agreements had consequences, and exceptions created precedents I wasn't willing to establish. Vanessa had requested a written explanation of the late fee calculation, which I provided along with a reminder that future payments were due by the 1st of each month, regardless of external circumstances like bank processing delays or mail delivery issues. Professional correspondence that left no room for negotiation or appeal. Their social life had contracted significantly since the dinner party incident. I rarely saw evidence of entertaining, and the few visitors they did have seemed to leave earlier and speak more quietly than before. The apartment that had initially buzzed with the energy of young people exploring their new community had become cautious, contained, subject to invisible boundaries that shaped every decision about how to use their own living space. The breaking point came in mid-February, triggered by something as mundane as a snowstorm and the maintenance responsibilities that Vanessa had underestimated when she signed the lease. Vermont's winter had been particularly harsh that year, with a series of storms that dumped heavy snow across Burlington and surrounding areas. The city's snow removal crews focused on main roads and emergency routes, leaving residential streets and private property to be managed by individual property owners and tenants. According to their lease, Marcus and Vanessa were responsible for clearing the walkways and driveway within 24 hours of any snowfall exceeding 2 inches. The provision had seemed reasonable in October, even practical for a young couple who presumably enjoyed winter activities and owned appropriate equipment. But February's reality proved more challenging than autumn's assumptions. The storm arrived on a Tuesday evening, dropping 8 inches of heavy, wet snow that continued falling through Wednesday morning. By the time it stopped, the driveway and walkways were buried under snow that would require hours of work to clear properly. Marcus had left early that morning for a 3-day business trip to Boston, a consulting contract that couldn't be postponed despite the weather conditions. Vanessa was left to handle the snow removal alone, armed with a shovel they had purchased optimistically in November, but had rarely needed to use. I watched from my living room window as she made several attempts to clear the driveway, each effort lasting only 20 or 30 minutes before the cold and physical demands forced her back inside. By Thursday afternoon, the pathways remained largely impassable, creating a clear violation of the lease terms that governed property maintenance. At exactly 5 o'clock, the end of the 24-hour compliance window, I walked across the yard to deliver the formal notice that the situation required. Vanessa answered the door wearing wool socks and a heavy sweater, her cheeks still flushed from her most recent attempt at snow removal. Behind her, I could see the apartment's warm interior, the life she had built there over the past 4 months. Photographs on the walls, books scattered on the coffee table, the cozy domestic scene of someone who had begun to think of this place as home. "Emily," she said, and her voice carried a note of resignation that suggested she already knew why I was there. "I need to inform you that the snow removal requirement hasn't been met within the specified time frame," I said, handing her the formal notice I had typed on my official letterhead. "This constitutes a maintenance violation under Section 7 of your lease agreement." She took the letter but didn't open it immediately. "Marcus is out of town until Friday, and I've been trying to clear it myself, but the snow is really heavy." "I understand that circumstances can be challenging," I replied, "but the lease doesn't include exceptions for travel schedules or weather conditions. The responsibility remains in effect regardless of personal situations." "What does this mean exactly?" she asked, finally unfolding the notice to scan its contents. "First violation results in a written warning, which this notice provides. The snow must be cleared within 48 hours to avoid additional penalties. If you're unable to handle the physical work yourself, you'll need to hire a service." I could see her calculating the cost and logistics of hiring professional snow removal with less than 2 days' notice during a week when every service in Burlington was already overwhelmed with similar requests. The expense would be significant, the availability uncertain, and the precedent would establish that any future snow removal issues would require expensive professional solutions. "This seems excessive for a maintenance issue that's only 1 day overdue," she said, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. "Lease violations accumulate," I explained. 3 written warnings trigger a formal review of tenancy continuation. It's important to address issues promptly to avoid more serious consequences. That was the moment when something shifted in Vanessa's expression, when the careful politeness that had characterized all our interactions finally gave way to something more direct and honest. "You're enjoying this," she said, not accusingly but with the flat certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. "I'm enforcing a legal agreement that protects my property interests," I replied. "No, you're punishing us. For the wedding, for not letting you give a speech, for treating you like you didn't matter." The conversation had finally reached the truth that we had all been dancing around for months. "I'm treating you exactly the way you taught me to treat family relationships. With clear boundaries, professional management, and consistent enforcement of agreed-upon terms. That's not what we wanted from living here. What you wanted was a charming apartment at below-market rent with a landlord who would be flexible about rules and accommodating about problems. What you got was a business relationship that operates according to the same principles you use to manage your wedding." Vanessa stood in her doorway, holding the violation notice and staring at me with an expression that combined frustration, recognition, and something that might have been respect. "You're never going to let this go, are you?" "There's nothing to let go. We have a lease agreement that governs our relationship for the next 2 months. After that, you're free to find housing that better suits your preferences." 2 months? Your lease expires in April. The early termination restrictions prevent you from leaving sooner, and renewal requires landlord approval, which I'm not prepared to grant. The information hit her like a physical blow. In all their focus on managing the immediate challenges of the lease restrictions, they had apparently forgotten that their tenancy was temporary and subject to my approval for extension. "We assumed we could stay longer if we wanted to. Marcus said this was a trial run for living in Vermont permanently." Marcus assumed incorrectly. "This is a 6-month lease with no guarantee of renewal. I'll need you to vacate by April 15th. I left her standing in the doorway, holding the snow removal violation notice and processing the reality that their Vermont experiment would end in 2 months, whether they were ready or not. The apartment they had begun to think of as home was actually a temporary arrangement controlled entirely by someone they had consistently underestimated. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched them prepare for the end of their tenancy, with the same efficiency they had brought to their wedding planning, but without the joy or anticipation that had driven their earlier efforts. They hired professional snow removal for the remainder of the winter. They submitted all maintenance requests in writing during business hours. They complied with every lease provision while quietly preparing to relocate their lives once again. Marcus called several times during those final weeks, attempting to negotiate for lease renewal or at least an extension that would give them more time to find alternative housing. Each conversation followed the same pattern. His appeals to family relationships met with my consistent reminders that business arrangements required different considerations than personal ones. "We could pay more rent," he offered during one particularly desperate call. "Market rate, whatever you think is fair." "The issue isn't financial," I explained. "It's about finding tenants whose living style is compatible with the property requirements." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm looking for tenants who understand that lease agreements are binding commitments rather than starting points for ongoing negotiations." Vanessa, to her credit, never asked for exceptions or special consideration during those final weeks. She had apparently accepted that their relationship with me would be conducted according to the terms I had established, and she approached the end of their tenancy with the same professional efficiency she brought to her work responsibilities. On their final day, she delivered the keys along with a forwarding address and a check for the utility transfers. The apartment was spotless, restored to exactly the conditions specified in their lease agreement. No damage, no violations, no grounds for retaining any portion of their security deposit. "I want you to know that I understand what you did," she said as we completed the final inspection. "And I probably deserved it." "You didn't deserve anything," I replied. "You simply made choices that had consequences you hadn't anticipated." "Will you tell Marcus that I finally figured it out? The real lesson." "What lesson is that?" "That the people you ignore don't disappear. They just stop letting you take them for granted." I returned their full security deposit that afternoon, along with a formal letter confirming the successful completion of their tenancy. Professional courtesy that acknowledged their compliance with lease terms, while making no promises about future relationships or renewed family warmth. 6 months later, Marcus called to tell me they had purchased a house in Boston, settled into new jobs, and were expecting their first child. He sounded happy, established, ready to build the life that Vanessa had always envisioned for them. "We learned a lot in Vermont," he said near the end of our conversation. "I'm sure you did. Mom, I want you to know that if we ever get married again, you'll be the first person we ask to speak." I laughed, the first genuine laughter I had shared with my son in almost a year. "Marcus, if you get married again, you'll have bigger problems than wedding speeches." "You know what I mean." "I do. And I hope you won't need to get married again to remember that some people's voices matter, even when they don't speak the loudest." We talked for a few more minutes about the baby, about their new house, about the ordinary details of their ordinary happiness. And when I hung up the phone, I felt the satisfaction that comes not from winning an argument, but from teaching a lesson that was finally completely understood. The Pine Street apartment, rented within a week to a graduate student couple who read every word of the lease agreement, asked intelligent questions about the terms, and signed without complaint. They have been model tenants for 2 years now, quiet and responsible and appreciative of the clear expectations that govern our relationship. Sometimes they invite me for coffee, and I accept when my schedule allows. We talk about their studies, their plans after graduation, the small pleasures of living in Burlington. It's the kind of comfortable relationship that develops when people understand their roles and respect the boundaries that protect everyone involved. I never mention my previous tenants or the lessons that shaped the lease agreement they signed. Some stories are better left as private victories, quiet reminders that even the people who seem to have the least power often have more than anyone realizes, if they're willing to use it. After all, the most important speeches aren't always the ones given at weddings. Sometimes they're the ones delivered through actions, through consequences, through the patient application of terms and conditions that teach respect in ways that words alone never could. And sometimes the best revenge is simply ensuring that the people who silence you learn, definitively and permanently, exactly what your voice is worth when it's finally withdrawn from their lives entirely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.